And he made my career, okay? Because I had a very smart guy who came from a physics background and could complement many areas that I didn't have such advanced knowledge of, was very enthusiastic and had a medical training. So we had a great time together. And then I had more students come, and I've been very fortunate over the years to have many, many star students of all different walks from all over the world. But you want to go for quality and depth, not for speed and breadth.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I have read an interview that you did previously of, you wish that scientists and, mentors would hire trainees more so based on passion and based on their desire to strictly become a scientist rather than, just pure academic qualifications, or, you end up building too many students and sort of that focus towards each student gets lost. And these students sort of end up feeling a little bit, hopeless, and, their project doesn't get as much attention. So that is very good point. And yeah, your first lab is sort of quite famous nowadays. Everyone sort of is talking to town. And when you sort of opened up the first lab and you got the opportunity to sort of start with the Terry Fox Foundation to open up the Terry Fox labs, actually, how did that opportunity come by? Where? Yeah.
So let me take this moment to advertise From Dough to DNA. Have you heard of that book?
No, I have not actually.
Okay, so every single one of you, if you're in the Cancer Research Center, should go down to the Cancer Foundation office that's just down below the coffee shop and buy a book called From Dough to DNA, which was written by a former radiotherapist, actually. And it's the story of the origin of the Cancer Research Center. And as many of you will know, the empty lot that's on the other side of the building that we all now occupy, or I mean, I don't know how many, if any of you are from UBC, so I don't know who, you look kind of all familiar. Like
most of our audience is from BC Cancer, do not.
A lot of Terry Fox lab members, actually.
So the empty lot used to be a bakery, the McGavin's Bakery. McGavin's Bakery, just to step back a little bit further, Gemma, the workers in the bakery were not happy, and they decided to go on strike. And the ownership of McGavin's Bakery said, "We're not giving in." And so the bakery failed, and they shut it down, and McGavin's Bakery Company sold the property. The property actually was not just where that lot is. It had some other it had the property that is actually on Broadway. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but some of the buildings that I think remnants of them are still there, are the original bakery structures, but most of them have been rebuilt into something else. So it was not where the laneway is on the north side of the building, and then the properties beyond. Anyway, the then BC Cancer Foundation, which was responsible for all cancer care and had been created to have a place where cancer patients were treated in British Columbia, well, in Vancouver, because there wasn't much else besides Vancouver. Back in, I think, the 1930s, the Cancer Foundation got started, and they bought a house, and that became the Cancer Care Hospital for many years, and got some X-ray machines and later cobalt machines. So they bought this property. There was no government control or contribution to the hospital at that time, because hospitals in the old, the early part of the last century were things that were developed by well-meaning, more higher end members of the community. So they bought the McGavin property, so I recall, for $1 million, which was a lot of money in those days.
Yeah.
And then they turned around and sold the part you don't know about for $3 million or something. Anyway, there was very good investment. It's probably, I'm not remembering it correctly, but it may even be in this book. Anyway, so then in the so that was the beginning of everything. But the treatment place was this house that was actually where the garden is, the garden that sits on top of the PET scanning area and all that. That used to be a house. And they built onto the house eventually some wooden structures, and that's where the patients were. So when I arrived in the early 70s, there was the BC Cancer Foundation. There was this renovated house. The attic was the library. We used to go there and have our coffee. And the upper floor was where they had patients. And then across the road was a bakery, literally. It was exactly the way it was as a bakery. It was full of all the old machinery, the cold rooms, everything. And I was hired as number 2 by Lloyd Skarsgård, the Lloyd Skarsgård Prize. So he was the first scientific recruit to be director of research in was called the BC Cancer Agency at the time. And he was hired to build the negative pymeson line out at Triumph, because it was discovered, so this is before chemotherapy really penetrated Canada very much. So main thing was treating patients with cancers with radiation. So it had been discovered that you could get a better depth dose distribution. Instead of burning the skin, which is what X-rays do, and then penetrating, you could use cobalt and get inside the skin and dump the energy. But there were other kinds of radiation, of which negative pymesons was an example, that had a much better depth dose distribution. So he was, and that's how the Triumph project out at UBC actually got funded. They persuaded the government that it was going to have a medical application. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So that was the last piece of money they needed. So the BC Cancer Agency agreed to build a negative pymeson beamline off the side of the cyclotron and show how wonderful it would be for treating cancer patients. And Lloyd Skarsgård was hired and put into the bakery to hire people that would do that. So he hired me as his first person to be the biologist who would test all the tissues to see how to translate cobalt and X-ray radiation doses into negative pymeson doses. He hired somebody else to build the beamline in connection with the physics department, and himself, he was a biophysicist, like the one I just talked to you about, that would do cellular measurements. And so that's what we did. But I had this blood thing going on the side, which they were not very happy about because it wasn't really dedicated to the mainline thing. And then Alan finished his training as a God knows everything, and I wanted to develop a research program. By that time, bone marrow transplants had come to Canada, and Toronto was saying, "Oh well, we're going to do all the bone marrow transplants." And Alan said, "That's ridiculous. You're not going to ship patients halfway across the world to go to Toronto. And there's a big place in Seattle. It's the biggest facility in the world. So why don't we build one here? We can benefit from their expertise. So he launched on a big program to write government stuff and get more tissue. We started a big program in hematopoiesis of patients. And government kept saying no. So then he said, well, okay, in the Division of Hematology, we'll just send our patients to Seattle because we can drive them down. That'd be safer than shipping them across the country. And the bill came back. They quickly figured out that they could do 10 patients for the cost of running a bone marrow transplant program here. And we could do 20 or 30. So that was very persuasive. They did not like that bill or those bills. I think they did 3 altogether. Anyway, so they gave some money to start a bone marrow transplant program. And okay, so now how did the TFL get started? So we're working away in the bakery, Alan's writing all these proposals, and we're doing this research together. By that time, I got kicked out of the medical biophysics program because they had built the beamline and were starting to treat patients, and they didn't really think they wanted me anymore. So we were kind of living like loners, but they had this huge bakery, so the space was not an issue. And we were very inventive about buying tables and hoods and living in empty space. And then we went on holiday. We went to Nova Scotia to visit Alan's parents. And that was in 1980, summer of 1980. And when we were there, we saw on television that this crazy guy from Port Coquitlam was going to do a run. He had actually started in Nova Scotia and was running across Canada to raise money. And that was totally weird. And then he got to Ontario when we were actually in Nova Scotia. And when he got to Ontario, by that time he'd raised quite a lot of money. And the people in Ontario, the government in Ontario said, oh, I should back up for a minute. Terry Fox was I don't know if you read his story, you should do that too, because you should be proud of what came out of BC. But anyway, when Terry was diagnosed when he was a late teenager, he got this idea of running across Canada, raising money for research, because osteosarcoma was a huge problem in those days. Yeah. And found out that research in Canada was funded by peer-reviewed research. So he said, that's what I want to raise money for. And it's not going to be constrained except by excellence. So nobody's going to be able to designate that it goes to their neighbor or their friend or their geographic affiliate. It's going to go to the National Cancer Institute of Canada, which doesn't exist anymore, which used to be run by the Cancer Society. And my money's all going to go there because they have the best peer review, which was true at that time. And there was no cancer program in CIHR. No, that was before CIHR was called the Medical Research Council, but cancer wasn't a big part of their mandate. And so that's how all the money was being collected and allocated, or it hadn't been allocated yet, but was being donated to the National Cancer Institute of Canada. Right. So the government in Ontario said, we're going to donate $1 million. It's unheard of. $1 million. This is in 1980. Okay, so I don't know. Yeah. Probably like 10 now, eh? Anyway, so we're going to donate $1 million, but it has to stay in Ontario for Boughton. But you know, Terry, how could he say no to $1 million? So he said, okay. Well, immediately the BC government thought, oh my God, Ontario's going to donate $1 million. They can't outdo us. Terry's from BC. So we're going to donate $1 million too. And it has to stay in BC. And that was all the thinking that went into it. So we heard about that. And about a few days later, we came back home and David Boyes, who was the head of the cancer agency at the time. He was the second most important person developing the pap smear, which also started here. And John Dirks, who was the head of medicine at UBC and VGH, then went back to Toronto and became head of the Gairdner for a while. So you can see what a small community is Canada. Anyway,
I know, right? Goodness me.
so these two people said, Connie and Alan, we've got $1 million for you because you've been agitating all this time for something, and we think you would be the right people. So that was amazing. And they said, well, of course, you need to form a group. And it was the idea of UBC that we would use the money to hire people, because that's what administrators always want to do.
Yeah.
And David Boyes said, well, you better go and think about actually what you want to do. So we went around and talked to a lot of people very quickly. And one of the people we talked to said, you guys, you can always get money for people. You can always get money for equipment. You can always get grants to do research. The one thing you will never get again is money for space. That was very wise suggestion. So that's when we went back and we said, we want to renovate space worth $1 million.
Yeah.
And there's, 3/4 of this bakery has not been renovated. So we would like 12,000 square feet of space to be renovated. So they thought that was actually a good idea. Then of course, we had to have the big, and we said we would like to take the northwest corner. Yeah. So we get the view and carve out that space. Well, then we had to renovate the building. They actually blocked off a lot of the windows, but they had to build a new floor. They had to put in a wheelchair-friendly elevator. They had to build the door that's, well, you don't know about the door. They had to build a new door and entrance down at the west end entrance and a stairwell. They had to fix the roof. By the time all this, it became to many millions of dollars. And there was not hardly enough money to even renovate a little corner for us.
Oh.
So we moved into the 12,000 square foot allocation, but there were only 4 labs that were finished enough to actually occupy and use as labs with running water and electricity and no furniture and so on and so forth. So that's how it got started. And I won't take up any more time telling that story, but we love to tell it. And you should all go and buy the book From Dough to DNA, because it has that story, I think, in it, and what happened subsequently as we grew. And eventually the Terry Fox lab got greedy and said, well, we want the space all the way to where the space is renovated, 20,000 square feet. And then that became very crowded. And eventually we, like the rest of the building, got moved into a new building, which seems like yesterday, but it's actually about 15 or 16 years now, I think, that we've been.
Wow. Yeah.
Anyway, you can see pictures of the old bakery and horses carrying carts in front of it, I
Horses.
think. Yeah.
Oh,
Believe it or not, yeah. Anyway, what else do you want to hear about?
Well, and you've met Terry Fox, haven't you?
I did. So that happened because his brother and friend went with him in the truck and filmed him. And they made a film of him running, which I'm sure you've seen many, many pictures. They're very famous.
Yeah.
And when he had to stop at the border of Ontario and Manitoba, they came back and put the film together, the video of what they had filmed so far. And they came to the bakery, which was the only place with a lecture theater big enough to actually projected in the cancer facility, and ran through it to see if they liked what people liked what they had put together. And Terry was there, but he was so overwhelmed by what he considered his failure, and also he was undergoing relapse.
Yeah.
He couldn't actually bring himself to watch it. So he hung out in Jerry Crystal's lab, which was an add-on at the time. Wasn't really a lab, it was a sort of room that had a wall around it and a lot of tables in it. And I think by then we persuaded Fumio to join us, and he had a little sort of side area there. We put some tables in it and stuff. And so we went and talked to Terry there and met him. And, you know, he was just a very sensitive and impressive guy who had thought through things that very few teenagers even think about. And we were both very impressioned by him. And we remain to this day. We have a bronze statue of him that is just like one of his pictures that a famous sculptor in Manitoba, Leo Mall, made. And it's upstairs in our hallway where we see it every day, and reminds us what a powerful entity he was and how important he was to cancer research in Canada. Yeah, makes me feel all ooey inside just to talk about him. And his family. I mean, after he died in December of that year, and his mother and father and brothers took over his legacy. His mother went till she was in her 70s, I think, to schools across Canada, like relentlessly talking to public school children to enthrall them with the dream of Terry. And many of those people are, you know, well, how long ago is 1980? 40 years ago.
40 years now.
Yeah, so they're like my children, you know, who remember the run, but didn't know Terry, but were brought up with this legacy. Yeah.
I guess this legacy is sort of what, and it could be different, but sort of what kept you tied to the Terry Fox labs this whole time.
Well, it was because of the money that the Terry Fox lab was named after him. That's for sure. Yes, that was agreed on. And actually, we're not the only Terry Fox lab in Canada. There's at least one other in Newfoundland, I think in Newfoundland.
Yes.
But it doesn't matter. And the more, the better.
So I'm going to chime in and ask a question. Did you ever think about leaving Terry Fox Labs and going with Alan to stem cell?
No, yeah, you know, so that's another great story. We started actually, you know, I originally worked on red cell colonies. And why was that? Because white granulocyte macrophage colonies were discovered how to grow them and apply them to human cells, that technology. Actually, when I was a graduate student in the 1960s. And the thinking was, and then subsequent studies in Toronto showed that the cell of origin of the granulocyte macrophage colonies was not the same as the cell to make spleen colonies, which everybody thought in those days were the true stem cells. Now we know they're not, but anyway, they made mixed colonies, and that was thought to be the hallmark of a stem cell in those days. So they made multiple myeloid lineages, red cells, megakaryocytes, and granulocytes and macrophages, but not lymphoid cells, at least not reproducibly. So, so when I came to Toronto as a postdoc, Arthur Axelred's group had discovered, so he was another faculty member originally in the Ontario Cancer Institute, but had since gone to Toronto, on site in Toronto at the U of T. His group had developed a method of growing very tiny little red cell colonies for mice. And so the group I was with said, Till and McCullough, they said, you should work on that, because if we could grow both red cells and myeloid cells in the same colonies, then we would have a stem cell assay. So I set to work on that and learned a lot about how to do that. And the critical reagent required to make red cells grow, you should know, that's erythropoietin, right? But in those days, erythropoietin hadn't been identified. We knew there was a factor in the serum of people that got anemic, or animals that got anemic. And even some headway had been made in how to purify that. But it was just beginning, like purifying anything that was molecular was just beginning in the 1960s and 70s. So the source at that time came from another company in Toronto, which has since been turned into another company. I can't remember, one of the vaccine companies, I think, actually. Anyway, they were taking sheep and irradiating them and treating them with chemotherapy. And just before they died of anemia, they would bleed them out. And then they put it over a column and purified a factor that was enriched in its ability to stimulate red cells in mice. So we thought, that would work. And that was tested by this Toronto group to show that that would stimulate these colonies in vitro. But the colonies, the little teeny weeny colonies, were very sensitive to this factor. And being a quantitative person, I wanted to go to higher doses. And then we soon found we could grow bigger colonies with higher doses. But the material was very variable. And so we started to test which batches we want and tried to negotiate. I tried to negotiate buying the batch that was good. So they didn't want any of that. So I said, well, to hell with you, we're going to purify our own. So Alan said, oh, well, we'll just find all the anemic patients in BC. There's only, a dozen hematologists, and I know them all. In fact, I knew them all too. And we'll find out who's highly anemic, and we'll see if we can collect their urine. And Jerry Crystal, who had joined me as my first postdoc and had since become a faculty member, had as his project as a postdoc already to purify erythropoietin. So he developed better assays to measure it quantitatively, very quickly, very sensitively, and learned how to purify it. In fact, he developed a very novel way of getting rid of almost all the toxicity in one fell swoop using a special albumin column that had a thing linked to it that took the toxicity out. That column is still, I think it's still in the TFL cold room. We called it Big Bertha, and it's got full of blue crystals because it was called Affigel blue. Anyway, so we started purifying. We put freezers in all these patients. And we used to run around in our car with our kids collecting this urine. They'd sit on the cardboard boxes of frozen urine. We started doing it in Victoria. Imagine coming home in the summer with frozen urine in your back of the car with your kids sitting on it, waiting to see if you're going to get on the ferry in time. Anyway, we made EPO and started selling it at the same price as this company in Toronto, and made a little money, and the money all channeled back into the TFL to help buy extra equipment and finish. Like Keith Humphreys didn't have a finished lab, we helped finish that lab. And so on and so forth. And then Alan said one day, well, everybody's asking you to send them your fetal calf serum and your BSA that makes colonies grow. And why don't we just make all that? And I said, oh, you're crazy. Nobody's going to buy that stuff. But, he's smarter than me. So we started doing that. And we had hired a guy who was making media and selling it around the city. And we called that Ready Mix, okay? Because it made colonies red and because it was like instant Nescafe. Nescafe at a point, but anyway, we ended up calling it Ready Mix. So those were our two big products initially. And we sold them out of the lab, and then we expanded and sold lots of other things until the mid-90s. So, this is like almost 20 years later. The BC Cancer Foundation, which by now was just a foundation, but still gave a lot of money to run the people in the work in the Cancer Research Center. We asked them for a loan to buy more equipment so we could do this bigger and better, because it was all happening in the TFL. They said, no, we think you should make a company and get out. And we think to this day, it's because they thought it was going to become a public company and they would buy into it, make a lot of money because we've been very successful. But Alan said no, because he hates having a boss of any kind. And they said, well, well, then you have to buy everything that you bought, because it's actually owned by the BC Cancer Agency and the BC Cancer Foundation, some connection. And you also have to give some money back to the TFL because I don't know why. Anyway, that was the agreement. So we had to mortgage our house to buy the stuff, and we had to take money out of the money we were making, or the company was making. So the company didn't actually start until 1995, I think, somewhere around there. And we were both busy in the TFL. Alan was head of the TFL still. So there was no moment for us to be in this company. We were still growing the TFL and having a good time doing science. And Alan was still trying to develop the leukemia BMT program and blah, blah, blah. So it wasn't until Alan turned 65, okay, that's 15 years ago, guys. This year, 15 years ago. Retirement was mandatory still in BC. So they said, well, you have to retire. You're 65, you're out. And so he said, well, that's fine. Now I will go and live my dream where I am the total boss. Where he is. He's never been happier. And he tells me that I'm not allowed to work in stem cell or retire because he doesn't want me hanging around. So I better stay productive where I am. So I'm actually very happy with that solution. And he's planning to die in his office or his apartment, his gerontological apartment in stem cell. So there you go. That's the life plan.
Yes, the life plan right there.
So you better let a few other people ask questions before
I was just going to say, thank you so much for answering our questions and fulfilling our curiosities. So we'll move on to the audience questions. Laura, I think we could just start from the top.
So the most voted questions actually is people wanting to know what challenges did you face during your early stages of your career, being a woman in a male-dominated field? And how did you overcome these challenges?
Yeah. So I was asked that by the Michael Smith Foundation when they phoned me up a few weeks ago and said, we want to do one of these weekly things on you, which I actually haven't seen or heard because I don't have any of these Twitter or LinkedIn or any other accounts, but you guys can. Anyway, they asked me about that, and I said, well, first of all, I did my PhD in Britain, and Britain was very far advanced in their male-female attitude in the biomedical research arena. So the institution where I did my PhD, which was actually a cancer research hospital, was a radiotherapy hospital, but with an attached research institute to it. The assistant director of that was a woman, and there were at least 2 other female faculty within 50-foot radius of me on the floor I was training in. There were just 4 graduate students in that institution with about 30 faculty. But I didn't feel it was so weird being female. And I had very strong mentors. In fact, the assistant director was a Canadian by origin from Montreal originally, and very famous geneticist who discovered the phases of the cell cycle, which you should know about. Very famous paper by Elma Howard and Pelk. Pelk discovered autoradiography, which you probably never heard of, which you should know about. And Alma discovered that the cell cycle had gaps in it. And so she called those gaps in between S phase and mitosis. So she called those G1 and G2. First gap, second gap, very logical. She didn't call them Alma 1 and Alma 2 or Howard 1 or Howard 2. She called them Gap 1 and Gap 2. Very commendable. Anyway, so so I was kind of raised in that environment. And then I came back to Canada to a research institution where there was 1 faculty member and no trainees that were women. And they were very proud of how rigorous they would be because women couldn't probably get a PhD in their very rigorous environments. And they had never had a postdoc who'd survived more than a few weeks. And I said, well, guys, wait till you see me, literally. And in some ways, I enjoyed it a lot because, you know, when you're a female surrounded with no competition, it's pretty nice, and you have access to all these brilliant minds. So I did find it a bit off-putting, but I wouldn't say challenging. I didn't find it terribly negative, but I was also very fortunate in that I was healthy. I, you know, never got sick. I could stay up late. You know, I had all the things that you need to compete against some males that actually don't go very well without sleep and don't have those attributes. So, so I did very well, and I had chosen to work with probably the best scientists in the place. So I had access to those directly with very little competition, and it was great. And I've always believed that you thrive where there are people who respect you for what you are and what you want to achieve. And everybody has to know what that is. And, you know, I have certain ambitions and drives, but they're not necessarily the same for everybody. I go to conferences and people ask me, how do you have a balanced life? And I say, well, I don't want a balanced life. I don't have really friends very much except scientists. And I work all the time and I love it. But that's not everybody's cup of tea. You know, I was a mother, but you know, I never.
That's actually the next question regarding motherhood.
When my first kid was born, within minutes, and I was, you know, holding him, looking at this beautiful little monster, I said, okay, number 1, you're never going to get sick. Number 2, you're going to grow up to make your own friends and be independent. Because I was never very successful at the former. And so I had to learn differently to be the latter. And they all turned out like that. So I was very blessed. Nobody got sick very often. And when they did, we had nannies and caregivers and God knows what, one after another. And when our kids got to be branching between just before becoming teenagers and teenagers, they revolted and said, we don't want anybody anymore. We can do it ourselves. So we turned into a self-management family. We got a, what do you call it, an alarm system, so that if somebody broke in, we would be alerted to it afar, and they had to phone every day. But we managed, and they're all happy and healthy, and they all are married and have children, and we're been very fortunate. But that's not everybody's cup of tea. None of them have followed in our path. And in particular, none of the wives of our sons and none of the daughters, we have 2 daughters and 2 sons, have become independent, devoted to work right away. They've all stayed home and brought up their children. And they all sort of look back and think that I cheated them a bit. So, you live with.
Because that's the rumor, right? That 1 week later you were in the postdoc in the office going around with the baby.
Is Laura. The first one I stayed home 2 weeks because I had to find somebody to look after the kid because I hadn't thought about that. And was fortunate to find somebody that I was happy with. And the last one I had on Friday night, and I went back to work on Monday morning. And the radiotherapist who wrote From Dough to DNA was coming over and discussing things with me. And he said, he looked at me in my, we used to wear these balloon maternity dresses. And when you've had a baby, you don't look so wonderfully different. Those of you who haven't had children yet, you think this baby is going to take away all that stuff? No, no way. Yeah, amazing amount of it is just you. That takes a few weeks to get rid of. Anyway, so I'm there in my maternity dress, and he looks over at me and he says, and when are you going to have that damn thing anyway? I remember to this day. And I said, I've had it. I was so angry that he couldn't see how elegant I was in this maternity dress. Anyway, so that's the story, full of stories. Yeah. So that is the one thing you should all do. Cultivate the stories and remember the good ones and suppress and get rid of the bad ones, because there will be bad ones. I can tell you a few bad ones. But anyway, yeah. And if your kids need you, you should respond to their needs because they're more important than anything else. And you will find that out throughout your life with them. Yeah. And they will make life different for you. But your trainees are also your mental kids. Yeah. And I'm very close to people like Keith and many people who, I only see every few years, but trained in the TFL in 80s, 90s. Yeah.
Okay, do we have time for one last question? Or would you
I
say
do.
we're over? Okay.
One more question.
So the last question is, do you think that most of the labs being established right now are being established with PIs that have an MD, or is it still possible to have a PhD and get grants and get faculty positions without being an MD in the biology field?
Oh, I think very much so. I think there is a growing appreciation that you need everything. You need people who are going to be mostly clinical, you need people who are going to be both, and you need people who are going to be fundamental scientists. And that's harks back to what I was saying at the very beginning when you asked me about the collaborating thing. You cannot be absolutely expert in everything. And so you need to have people who are going to bridge. You need people who are going to be very focused on translation and delivery and know all the things that go about that and retain it. And, you know, that's all changing too. So you have to stay upfront on all of these different technologies. You know, when Alan trained as a PhD, he had to go back and do internal medicine after being 5 years out. And he found that the most traumatic experience in his life because everything had changed. Echocardiograms had changed, neural monitoring had changed. And most people will tell you 2 years away from medicine is about all you can tolerate. So that's just to illustrate for you that medicine is evolving, not just basic science. Mm-hmm. And as you know, basic science is evolving, and it requires methods development, not just understanding how to use them. The methods are being changed, how we learn about new things, how we push the frontiers of the depths with which now you can look at, in an EM, you can look at molecules. People are doing that all the time. You know, that's just in the last 10 years. People were dreaming about it when I was a postdoc and pretending that they were getting close to it, but not really. So, and look at iPhones. You know, when I was a kid, they just introduced telephones. Telephones, actual telephones that you ringed around.
Yeah, you gotta circle around.
Line and everybody could hear what you were saying, or all around the block. Now nobody even has one of those. You guys don't even know how to use it. You think it's something that you see in a play, but you don't know what it is. And now, you know, how many people have cameras? Most people just use their phone. Yeah. Because they're so, they can take pictures so well now that you don't need a camera. So, and that's just the beginning, you know. People are going to Mars now. Well, people aren't going to Mars, but we're sending stuff to Mars. And who knows what's going to be found in the next 10 years. I think our ability to extrapolate is just not very good because we don't know. iPS cells were discovered 10 years ago. CRISPR was discovered how many? 5 years ago. These things have revolutionized our whole concept of development, our whole concept of how we can manipulate cells. You know, the sky is wide open. We don't need to talk about what you're born with anymore. We need to talk about what we want to have happen, how we want to shape ourselves as a human race, how we want to bridge the gap of people who understand things and are trying to be at the edge of science, and people who have left it when they're teenagers. Can you imagine? They, you know, people who don't know how to read yet. You know, it's just criminal, the gap that is now developing between different peoples. People who are, you know, don't understand the difference between male and female. You know, it's just craziness. So we have big challenges that are coming, not just big opportunities. And it's your generation that has to think about it because you're going to be 40 and 50 when this is all playing out. And that's, you know, sooner than you think. You got big jobs to do, guys. Big jobs. And I'll be watching from my gerontological apartment.
Hopefully they stop aging by then. But
well, that's another big challenge. I'm hoping, but it's getting a little too late for me. But you know, maybe not. Who knows? tell me how to do it. I'm going to be first person in the
First trial.
Line.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
So
this has been a great insight, and learned a lot about how you sort of started and how, what you think about sort of the future of science. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's been a huge honor to talk to you. And it's been a very fun talk. For
So
sure.
let me just say, don't forget to go down and buy Dough to DNA. It only costs, well, it used to only cost $30. And it would be your little token donation to the foundation. And if enough people went down, they would realize what a valuable book it is. It's a great Christmas present, and I don't know why they don't have it on big display, but I've bought a lot of copies and sent them around. So I encourage you all to do that.
Yeah, and we can also send it over to the participants through email to check it out after. So
yeah,
definitely.
Okay.
reminder email. Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you so
Well,
much,
Talking to
Connie.
you. Lots of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
The fun was on us, and hopefully we could, see you around more often here after once the pandemic sort of settles down.
I suspect by fall you'll see almost everybody back. Most-
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Sounds good.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
again.
Bye, everybody.
Good to see you around.